Welcome to this week's chat with this guy, Tom Bodett. And this week we'll be talking about fibers and then yarns. Fibers, primarily pertaining to the weaving, historically have been centered around wool, cotton, linen, silk, and the synthetics. And what we'll do is cover generalities of each with respect to the novice weaver and not so novice weavers, because in reality there have been volumes and volumes and volumes written on each extensively. So if you want to go beyond what we're going to talk about today, there's plenty of research to be done. We'll start with wool. Wool, one of the most important throughout the ages, not so much of late, but throughout the ages, wool was one of the primary fibers used by weavers throughout the world. And in many cases, even though cotton was known, and so was linen, wool was preferred for many uses, primarily rugs and carpets, which were a big necessity in years gone by. I should say millennium gone by. Because weaving's been around, as you know, for 4,000 or 5,000 years, and throughout most of that time, we have evidence that wool was utilized in weaving. Linen was, and so was cotton. And later in the years, silk. But primarily, wool was one of the chief, and it had great properties and became a favorite of weavers for the most part through simply its performance in the field. They had no way of measuring why wool was so good for what they wanted to do with it. Rugs primarily, blankets, canvases of wool. But it performed over years, stood up, it died well, and things of that type, so they naturally favored wool. In later years, more recently, where scientific methods have been developed to test various fibers, we found out why wool was so favorable. The wool fiber has the best compaction and recovery qualities of any fiber known. And what we mean by that is that if you stand a group of wool fibers on end and you beat on it continually, it'll flex and then it'll go back. It'll flex and come back. Well, they found that wool outperforms all the other fibers by far in its recovery after compaction, and this obviously was a great asset in carpets, in blankets, in any number of fabrics that required rough use on the surface. Now there are various grades of wool depending on the breed of the sheep and the area in which the fleece is located. Very, very fine wools are usually produced, are produced by the Merino and Frambolet breeds of sheep, and they produce the finest wools that you can actually make garments out of and wear them next to your skin, and it won't itch you to death. But the coarser you go into wools, they become kind of scratchy, and therefore were made for mostly outerwear, and you would wear something under to protect from the rough surface. The grades of wool go down through the various breeds, from Leicester to whatever you name. There are a number of them, and there are two ways to measure the quality of wool. One is the blood system, which is derived from Old England and European sources, where they graded the sheep by the amount of merino blood that was in the sheep, and they would grow them for various reasons. Purebred merino were the finest, and in numeric measure, that was graded at 80s to 82s, 84s, which is the finest of fiber in the wool breed known. And then it grades down from 70s, 72s, which are usually Texas wools, to the 60s, Australian wool, and then on down the course of the nat that most carpets are wool from, and those are the English breeds that are, for the most part, coarser wools. And the choice, of course, is up to the weaver as to which, what product they want to produce. So when you're looking at wool, you're looking at wool for the fine wear and longevity. Wool also has the highest water regain, which means that it wicks extremely well, and worn next to or near next to the body, of course, will wick water and disperse it much better than many other fibers. So that it's a choice for that. Because it does absorb more water than most of the other fibers, it's usually preferred for dyeing purposes also, where that fabric, the end use of the fabric is in the wool is desired. Now we'll talk about cotton. Cotton, of course, has been king for, again, millennium, and it was grown throughout certain areas of the world originally, and those areas of the world became known as producers of fine cotton. Today, those types of cotton are grown all over the world, where the climate and the humidity is ideal for that particular strain. The most popular and probably the finest, longest staple cottons are the Sea Island or Egyptian, or there's one other escapes my mind right now, but there are three, and you'll see them usually touted in the label of any product that you want to buy as being superior. They have the longest, finest staple, which means that you can spin the finest cottons out of them. And that was known for, of course, eons. There have been recovered from digs throughout the Middle East, and they've been carbon dated fabric that's been carbon dated for 3,000 and 4,000 years, where the thread count is amazing. How they accomplished this is still a mystery, because it's far denser than a lot of fabric that we could possibly produce today. We're talking 400 and 500 ends per inch of a cotton fiber, and the same with linen. But cotton is primarily, it also has a good water absorption. Second to wool. Wool is around 9 to 11% regain. Cotton can be anywhere from 8 to 9% regain, which is good. And with the mercerized cotton is slightly better. Both wool and cotton are preferred by new weavers because they are considered friendly. And what we mean by friendly is they have, after being spun, they have a very good elongation and recovery, which I'll get into when we're talking about yarns. But that made the cotton fiber extremely popular. Again, they had no scientific reason or ways of determining this, but through performance in the field, they favored cotton mostly for apparel in a warmer climates and so forth, bed sheeting, things of that type. Then we'll talk about linen. Now linen's a little bit different, but actually I meant to mention that wool is a protein fiber, and cotton is cellulosic, all pure cellulosic, and so is linen. Now linen derives from the flax plant, and although it's much more difficult to prepare for spinning than cotton, it has qualities that make it very worthwhile to a lot of people to go through the longer term preparation of separating it from the outer bark of the plant and producing a fibrous type material that can be spun. It's great for things like, in many years past, bedspreads actually, but linenware, tableware, and things of that type, because after weaving, the more the linen is washed and ironed, the more lustrous it becomes and more appealing it becomes. So it's a favorite for dinnerware. The linen is a little more difficult to handle, and again is considered less favorable to the new weaver because the elongation and recovery while weaving is considerably less than cotton or wool, and therefore a lot of times newer weavers will shy away from it. We'll get into that when we talk about yarns. The primary, later in years, the primary favorite fiber was silk. And silk is pretty unique because it's produced from a worm that through its life span is short, but it produces a continuous fibrous, which in actual fact, all of the synthetic fibers known today, their method of development was copied after the silkworm and how the silkworm produces that fiber. But anyway, silk is obviously very lustrous. It produces beautiful fabric. After the development out of the Orient throughout Western Europe of silk, it became quite popular. But woven primarily in Europe, when the colonies were developed in the U.S. During the colonial period, there were many states that tried to produce silk, even started planting thousands of mulberry trees to produce it, but it was never, the industry never really developed in the U.S. Italy and France developed the finest silk producing facilities, and it remains so today. Although one area in Manchester, Connecticut, known as Cheney Mills, they did produce excellent silk and did for years, but that was the only manufacturing operation that did. As far as synthetics are concerned, there are numerous, and they became popular probably in the 1960s. They became extremely popular because of the wash and wear. qualities that they offered. And very gradually they pushed the synthetics, whether it's acrylics, polyesters, any of them, polyurethanes. They're all produced through spinnerets from a liquid that is developed in the laboratory. The material is forced in a liquid form through what we call a spinneret, which is exactly what the silkworm has in its makeup that produces silk. The silkworm has two apertures in its head that actually, when the worm is ready to start producing the cocoon that it wraps itself in, the two major apertures will produce this fibrous material, and the two smaller apertures produce what they call a sericin, which is a coating that wraps those two individual solid fibers together as it's produced. And that's exactly what the synthetic yarns, the spinneret method, is copied from. So with that, the synthetics are in general not as favorable as far as water handling is concerned. They don't wick water as well as either cotton or linen, and certainly nowhere near what wool does. And even that being the fact, in today's wash and wear, even though the fabric against the skin, in many cases, if you're in a high humidity area, you'll feel clamminess from the material. And if you'll notice, in many garments that synthetic fibers are utilized in, it's apt to produce pilling in sweaters or any garment that's made with the synthetic in it. If the staple of the synthetic cut that they spun with, say with the cotton or even with the wool, if it's abraded, it tends to want to pull out of the yarn itself and form a pill. So if you see a pilly sweater or any garment that's pretty pilly, it's probably because it's got the synthetic in it that has been pulled out of the twist of the yarn. So with that, in general, those are the categories of yarns, of fibers that we look at today as being utilized for weaving. And next we'll talk about the yarns themselves that these fibers are spun from.